Theodore Beauchaine, who is a professor of psychology at Ohio State University. He earned his PhD in clinical psychology with a quantitative minor at Stony Brook University. He is a past recipient of both the American Psychological Association Distinguished Scientific Award for Early Career Contributions to Psychology and the American Psychological Association Mid-Career Award for Outstanding Contributions to benefit children, youth, and families. Ted's research addresses development of behavioral impulsivity, emotion dysregulation, externalizing behavior, and intentional self-injury in children, adolescents, and adults across multiple levels of analysis spanning genes to environment. So please join me in welcoming Professor Beauchaine.
This title, An Ontogenic Process Perspective on Adjustment Problems Across the Lifespan, what I'm trying to get at here is development. And I'm going to go full-blown developmental on you because I think it's imperative that we understand the development of aggressive behavior, other forms of externalizing behavior. And by ontogenic, what I mean is that the developmental processes that unfold for any individual, and that includes both biological vulnerabilities and resiliencies and how those interact and transact with environments across the lifespan, change us. And they change us in ways that we don't get to go back and redo. And so if I'm reared in one environment, and I know Columbus because that's where I live, if I'm on the east side, which is high in poverty and violence and criminality, versus the same kid reared where I live, which is low in violence and criminality, I'm a different person, not only psychologically, but biologically by the time I get to adulthood. And those changes diverge more and more over time. We know that from epigenetics work, and a question came up about epigenetics earlier. And so that's what I'm talking about ontogenic. So some objectives for today. First, describe developmental trajectories of impulsive behavior from preschool to adulthood at all relevant levels of analysis that we have time for those who are reared in high-risk environments in particular. So the life course persistent pattern of externalizing behavior that I'm about to go through has been known for many, many years, for over 50 years, since Lee Robbins wrote Deviant Children Grown Up in 1966. And so we know that in preschool, children, and this is largely males because when we study ADHD, 6, 7, 8 out of, well, the sex ratio is 6, 7, or 8 to 1 when we get up into the severe ranges, that hyperactivity impulsivity that's expressed in preschool is followed by oppositionality and aggression oftentimes, and many of you see this in your work settings. In middle school, we see school conduct problems and suspensions, disengagement and withdrawal from school and from other social reinforcement systems. Academic problems emerge. By adolescence, we see delinquent peer group affiliations, drug use and criminality, and by adulthood, we see incarceration and recidivism. And I'm not for a moment saying that every young boy who has ADHD is going to follow along that trajectory. That's certainly not true. But if we interview males who are incarcerated and have antisocial personality disorder, they almost invariably followed a trajectory that was similar to this one. If we go by the DSM-5, and our group has argued that this doesn't make the most sense, we would diagnose this child with ADHD, followed by oppositional defiant disorder, followed by early onset conduct disorder, followed by substance use and dependencies, followed by antisocial personality disorder. And we've argued that this really obscures the developmental pathway that I just outlined and keeps us from intervening and, more importantly, preventing earlier in life. A second objective is to present new data on impulsive girls who are understudied to date, and so to get at this issue of why do we see sex differences in impulsive behavior, including aggression. A third is to embrace ideological complexity. And our culture, American culture in particular, wants single large answers to problems and single easy cures. And there aren't any. And most of us know that by experience. So no single level of analysis, genes, maltreatment, neighborhood risk accounts for progression of impulsivity to more serious problems later in life. 4, consider complex interactions and transactions among child vulnerabilities and environmental risk factors across development. I won't be talking about childhood resiliencies. I think, and I hope that Jay is going to do that later. So I'm going to talk about complex, what we call molecular genetic burden, all the genetic vulnerability alleles that are associated with impulsive behavior. Complex neural functions. We've heard a bunch about that already, so that makes my job a lot easier. I'm going to talk about differential neuromaturation of cortical versus subcortical brain regions. So these deep brain regions that we've talked about, the amygdala, the striatum, mature very early in life. The frontal cortex matures very late in life. In fact, if you have children who are age 25, you know that. I'm going to talk about subcortical-cortical connectivity. James and Adrian talked some about that. And environmentally induced, parenthesized, neuroplastic changes in cortical structure and function. So I hope you'll indulge me for a minute before I really launch in with an open mind and an analogy. So here is the ontogenesis, the developmental progression of type 2 diabetes and how it changes the individual across development. So if we look at the syndrome level of analysis, it's very well characterized, and all of us in this room probably understand that. So we see insulin resistance emerge early on. That's followed by pancreatic cell death, later in development, weight gain, metabolic syndrome, heart disease, renal failure, and toward the end, at whatever age that may be, peripheral neuropathy, amputation, and all sorts of other complications. But we don't have an insulin resistance disorder, a pancreatic beta cell death disorder, a weight gain metabolic syndrome disorder, because we understand the underlying cause. We know that all of these things load on, in the parlance of quantitative psychologists, a single heritable trait that's in fact highly heritable. 0.8 is the heritability coefficient and 1 is the max. And we also know that multifactorial genetic burden, in other words, lots of genes contribute to type 2 diabetes, and in fact over 40 have been identified, none of which is necessary or sufficient for development of the disorder. And so there's the complexity. However, this doesn't mean that a person who has inherited this genetic vulnerability is destined to develop the end-state peripheral neuropathy, amputation, and other outcomes. We know there are environmental risk mediators that push, or rather pull, might be a better way to put it, people along this developmental progression. Fat and sugar intake, lack of exercise, stress, poor self-care. In the absence of these environmental contributors, a person with genetic vulnerability may never develop type 2 diabetes. And so I want you to think about this model as we talk about development of externalizing behavior across the lifespan. So, ontogenesis of externalizing behavior. At the syndrome level, I already talked about this. ADHD, oppositional defiant disorder, conduct disorder, delinquency, substance use and dependence, antisocial personality disorder, incarceration, and recidivism. At the behavioral genetic level of analysis, a single heritable trait accounts for a preponderance of covariation among these syndromes. And that's also about 80% heritable, as in the case of type 2 diabetes. We also know that there are a number of molecular genetic vulnerabilities, and in fact probably more than is the case for type 2 diabetes, none of which is necessary or sufficient for development of antisocial personality. We also know that environmental risk mediators are extremely important in pulling vulnerable individuals along this trajectory. So, work by Jerry Patterson on coercive family processes, by Tom DeShawn on deviant peer group affiliations, opportunity available and exposure to substances of abuse at an early age, neighborhood violence and criminality, all of those things pull genetically vulnerable kids along an externalizing trajectory. And in the absence of all these things, in protective environments, a vulnerable child may never develop past the point of ADHD. So let me talk quickly about trait impulsivity as a behavioral construct, shifting gears a little bit. Trait impulsivity is an individual difference. Kids don't have or not have ADHD. That's an arbitrary distinction that we make. When extreme, trait impulsivity is characterized by a preference for immediate rewards over delayed rewards. So I've got to have something now. Actions taken without forethought. We've all seen this. Failures to plan ahead. Deficiencies in self-control. As an individual difference, trait impulsivity is a normally distributed personality trait. So we have people all the way on one end who are very restrained in their behavior. We have unimpulsive people. We have people in the middle. We have people who are exuberant. And then we have highly impulsive people who we choose to characterize as having ADHD. Again, that's a highly heritable trait. It's stable across development. And it's rooted in well-characterized brain processes that we've heard about already that can become canalized across development in response to environmental risk. So we've heard already about cortical substrates of impulsivity. I love how easy my job is today. That's never the case. We know that approach-related emotions like wanting, like seeking, like enthusiasm are generated in large part by striatal reactivity, ventral and dorsal striatal reactivity, to anticipated incentives. We know this from animal and human literature, a bunch of which James described. This is Brian Knutsen's original study where he developed what's called the monetary incentive delay task, where we would put people in the magnet. They respond quickly for rewards, and we see this really strong neural response in the striatum, which is almost certainly dopaminergic. There are serotonin receptors and glucocorticoid receptors, but we know from animal work that this is largely a dopaminergic response. Striatal activity and reactivity to appetitive stimuli, including money, are associated with positive hedonic capacity and hedonic states. We feel pleasure when we're responding to incentives, regardless of their nature. Striatal underactivity is associated with anhedonia, trait irritability, and discontentment. And those are all hallmarks of externalizing disorders. And I haven't updated this, but James was a co-author on a big paper about this very recently. Striatal under-responding to incentives, monetary incentives in the scanner, is widely replicated in ADHD, as James mentioned, and other externalizing syndromes. Here is a figure from Schurz et al. That shows a response among controls. Can you see my, yeah, you can see my mouse here, until you can't. Among controls who have no ADHD, and then we're not seeing the same response in the striatum among those with ADHD to monetary incentives. Now, it turns out you can get a response in kids with ADHD in the striatum. You just have to give them more money. So what we find in our research is that if you give neurotypical kids 50 cents, it might take $5 to get the same level of striatal responding in a kid with ADHD. And I used to have a slide, but I eliminated it for the sake of time. So. Here are the results from a recent meta-analysis that show underactivity in the striatum to monetary incentives in ADHD in all but one study, and that one study fell right on 0. So this is a very consistent finding, much more consistent than most findings in our literature. This is another recent paper, just came out last year, that shows among those with alcohol, cannabis, cocaine, and nicotine dependence, whether abstinent or a mixture of abstinent and non-abstinent individuals, we see underactive striatal responding to incentives in the scanner. So this cuts across externalizing disorders. According to reward-seeking models, discontentment and irritability that are byproducts of the striatal under-responding, motivate reward-seeking behavior, impulsivity, substance use, etc. And that temporarily upregulates that aversive mood, but it doesn't do it for long, and so kids engage in more and more and larger searches for externalizing reinforcers. So, at one point in my career, I thought that this meant that we sort of understood something, and I'm at a different point in my career now, and I understand that we know nothing. And so, let me tell you a little bit about the complexities of striatal function, and this cuts at some of the issues that have already come up today. So, just to review quickly where we've come so far, we've got blunted striatal responding to incentives, both monetary and others in the environment. That's the neurobiological level of analysis. That leads to an emotional predisposition, an anhedonic irritable mood state at the emotional level of analysis. That gives rise to a behavioral bias toward reward seeking. And so this might be, well, this is an individual difference. At its extreme, it's expressed as trait impulsivity or ADHD. So that's our syndromal level of analysis. Blunted striatal responding is determined by a lot of different things, and John Constantino at Wash U and I wrote a review paper about this recently. So we've got all these different genetic factors that determine striatal responding. So we've got vulnerability allos, things that you've heard of, like the dopamine transporter, the dopamine receptor. We've got copy number variants that are inherited from parents. We've got de novo genetic mutations that are not inherited, all that affect striatal function. Then we've got environmental influences. Adrian was talking about traumatic brain injury, hypoxia, and teratogen exposure. Those affect striatal function. We've got epigenetic alterations that occur in response to in utero exposures to teratogens. Then we've got neurohormonal modulators, including testosterone for boys. Interestingly, though, estradiol and progesterone levels affect striatal function in women, and so there's one possible source of sex differences. And we've got hypothalamic pituitary adrenal axis function. So the complexity is overwhelming, and no single one of these factors is going to explain a lot of variation in impulsive behavior across, any size sample or the population. So now shifting from multifactorial influences on striatal function, how about cortical contributions? As we already said, the striatum is deep in the brain. This figure shows a number of different functional subdivisions of the prefrontal cortex. And then the subcortical structures are deep in the brain, caudate, putamen, nucleus accumbens, I don't know how well that shows up, not well on my screen, the hippocampus. And a heuristic that is sort of traditional in the neuroscience literature is that the subcortex plays a larger role in motivation and generation of emotion, whereas the cortex plays a larger role in behavior and emotion regulation. And as we mature, frontal brain structures become more effective at exerting top-down regulation over the emotions that are generated in the subcortex. Interestingly, the subcortex and cortex develop at very different rates. And so these are data from the Brain Development Cooperative Group, and I hope you can see that. I'll explain it to you. We've got the caudate nucleus and the putamen, which are parts of the striatum. And we've got different growth rates, blue for boys and red for girls, following tradition. And then we've got volumes. And so what we see is that across ages 4.8 years to age 18 years, very little in terms of volumetric growth in these subcortical structures. So in other words, the caudate and putamen are at least volumetrically mature by age 5. The situation with the cortex is very, very different. And so one thing to call your attention to is that volumes are much bigger, of course, because we're talking about an enormous brain region. But what we see is reducing frontal gray matter for boys and girls, and increases in frontal white matter for boys and girls. So there's a lot going on in the frontal cortex, much more than is going on in subcortical regions. And if we think about the role that the frontal cortex plays in helping us down-regulate our emotions, it might explain some things. So my recollection is when I was 5, my anger, which is presumably being generated by deep subcortical structures, was the same as it is today. It felt the same to be angry at 5 as it feels today to be angry. I get angry about different things, and at least in public, I'm much better able to down-regulate that anger. And that, presumably, is because my frontal cortex is more efficient. Differential neuromaturation is one explanation for engagement in normative risky behaviors in adolescence. And so this figure is from B.J. Casey, who's at Yale, and it shows that development of the subcortex is happening faster, so those deep brain regions, development of the cortex is occurring slower, and that while there's a big gap in development in these regions, we have risky behavior going on, and that includes externalizing behavior for both boys and girls, but more for boys, and other forms of risky behavior. Now we're moving to a point where we're starting to map all kinds of different developmental trajectories. Here we've got, this is a paper that just came out last month by Hauser et al., and it shows differential patterns of maturation for white matter, for dopamine neurons, for gray matter, for mesocortical projections, which are going to be largely dopaminergic, for mesolimbic projections. And so we're getting a handle on brain development that's much more nuanced than we had previously. Among males who progress to conduct disorder, frontal neuromaturation is compromised. And this is an important paper by DeBrito et al. That shows orbital frontal cortex and anterior cingulate cortex gray matter volume among children, males, ages 10 to 13 and a half. And what it shows is no difference, no pruning of frontal gray matter among the males with conduct disorder, whereas we see expected gray matter pruning among control males who are age matched. So neuromaturation is not going as it should. We also see cortical connectivity deficiencies, and this is our first neuroimaging study that we ever did about a decade ago. This is during extinction, I would call it. So we have boys in the scanner. They're responding as fast as they can for money, and they actually get the money after the session's over. So this is no fake experiment. They're walking away with, on average, about $30. And so the stakes are high. And during certain trials, we take the rewards away from them. So they no longer get the money that they're used to getting. And specifically during these extinction trials, we see in control boys connectivity between the caudate and the anterior cingulate cortex. In boys with ADHD and conduct disorder, we see less connectivity. And in fact, this is a significant difference. So they're showing connectivity, but significantly less. When we look at top-down connectivity, and we're wanting the frontal cortex to down-regulate emotional responses under these kinds of circumstances, we see top-down connectivity among controls, but no top-down connectivity among those with ADHD and conduct disorder. I also want to say a couple of words about adversity in prefrontal cortex neuromaturation. We know that environmental adversities affect PFC neuromaturation strongly. This is a great paper to read that was in Pediatrics in 2015 by Joan Luby at WashU. Poverty, for one. Children who live below federal poverty levels show a 7 to 10% reduction in frontal volumes compared with controls. This graph is from Seth Pollack's group at the University of Wisconsin, and it shows volumes of the frontal cortex from ages 5 to 37 months old. We're talking about infants to toddlers. And we see large differences between those who are reared in high-risk environments versus those who are reared in low socioeconomic status environments. What the specific causes are? Well, certainly they have to do with low nutrition, among other things, and we could probably come up with a list that's 10 items long. But this is really troubling, that these kids who are infancy to 3 are already showing this big hit on a brain region that's so important for self-regulation for the rest of their lives. Child abuse and neglect, which is common in externalizing samples, as we've already heard, is associated with dose-response reductions in orbital frontal cortex volumes. And I took out my slide for that in the interest of time. Institutionalization, Adrian referred to children reared in Romanian orphanages who exhibit smaller cortical volumes than controls. So all of this is telling us we need to enrich kids' environments. We need to intervene. We need to prevent at an early age if we want to forestall these developmental trajectories in frontal brain development. Neuropredictors and sequelae of substance abuse. So now shifting from childhood into adolescence, we see blunted striatal responses to reward are associated with vulnerability to marijuana, cocaine, methamphetamine abuse, and addiction 3 years later. So adolescents who, through likely heritable mechanisms, although there might be some insults in there as well, are showing blunted responses to reward. Those are prospectively predicting initiation and use of substances 3 years later. Heavy drinking in adolescence is associated with faster gray matter loss and slower white matter growth in the cortex over 2 years. These are data that are coming from the UCSD group, Susan Tapert in particular. And so what we see here in the green bars is gray matter change among heavy drinkers compared with moderate drinkers and those who don't drink. Remember, we're supposed to see gray matter pruning across adolescence, but what this is showing us is that heavy drinking is accelerating that gray matter pruning in ways that it apparently shouldn't. Here is central white matter, so not only is gray matter pruning being suppressed, white matter growth is happening more slowly in those heavy drinking adolescents as well. Poor subcortical-cortical connectivity is also observed in those samples. And so the bottom line, at least to me as I read the literature, is by the time many impulsive children reach adolescence, and they're impulsive, of course, through no fault of their own, their existing subcortical vulnerabilities are amplified by environmental adversities and risk exposures, which alter neurodevelopment of cortical brain regions that are critical to self and emotion regulation. So they get a double hit. And so here's our elaborated neurodevelopmental model. So I've already shown you this model in a different form. We've got this highly heritable trait, which I don't want to say gives rise to, but which all of these different syndromes, if you will, load on. We've got environmental risk mediators. And our argument is that self and emotion dysregulation, which arise from deficient cortical development and cortical subcortical connectivity, become increasingly important across development as males in this case progress from ADHD early in life to antisocial outcomes later in life. If we want to do something about that, the time to do something about it is very early. And so, my heading wrapped around here. So, implications for prevention. Who is familiar with the Fast Track Prevention trial that NIH funded? So a number of you are, but not nearly everyone. So let me tell you very quickly about Fast Track. It enrolled 891 high-risk kindergartners in Seattle, Durham, Nashville, and rural Pennsylvania. They were selected from almost 10,000 based on parent-teacher reports of early conduct problems. It was an intensive 10-year-long prevention program that began in 1991. And NIMH almost didn't fund the competing renewal because the effect sizes for the prevention trial were so small at 5 years. It must have been 4. There's no way they could have done 5 years of prevention and 5 years of funding. But so here's a little bit about what the prevention program looked like. 57 2-hour sessions with children, parents, program staff, and teachers, targeting self-control, emotional awareness, peer relations, problem solving. All of those things that go into good emotion regulation, self-regulation, executive function, the things that we need our cortices to do for us. Parents taught to tutor their children academically. So not only are the children being intervened with, parents are being taught how to parent. Monthly family sessions, home visit, teacher-implemented prevention. Monthly parent and child groups and home visits. Individual sessions addressing high school transition, note-taking, study skills, etc. So it was a prevention trial. It was a Cadillac prevention trial, if you will. It was expensive. And it was targeted. It had limited effects, as I already said, in the early years. Effect sizes accrued through age 25. And so at age 25, which is about how old, they've got to be older than that now. So the age 25 data showed lower externalizing problems, lower substance use, lower violent crime convictions, lower internalizing problems, less high-risk sexual behavior, and fewer drug convictions in the mid-20s. So the prevention program had the effects it was supposed to have. It just didn't have them immediately. And many of these effect sizes are large, which I should mention. That contrasts very sharply with long-term outcomes of the NIMH multimodal treatment of ADHD study, which were time-limited. In fact, there's no distinguishing between the intervention group and the intervention groups and the control group at this time, and they're in their 20s as well. It was a very brief intervention. So prevention programs that target mediating mechanisms of externalizing progression are effective when they're delivered early, when they involve parents, and when they teach children effective self-regulation. I'm so glad to see Carolyn Webster Stratton is here to give a workshop because she can tell you all this much better than I can. The US healthcare system, the way we're set up, we ignore development and we ignore context. And so here is the developmental progression that I said we've known about for so many years. How do we handle this? ADHD, we prescribe meds, and I'm not anti-medication by any stretch of the imagination, but it's not going to do the trick all by itself. Oppositional defiant disorder, more meds. This shows US stimulant prescriptions from 1991 to 2011, and this trajectory has continued in the intervening 8 years. One has to ask, okay, even if meds are necessary for many children with ADHD, are they this necessary? And what we find actually is that many of them are being prescribed to kids who don't have ADHD. Disruptive mood dysregulation disorder, new to the DSM-5, is being diagnosed. They get different meds. This shows atypical antipsychotic prescriptions from 1999 to 2008. I couldn't find a graphic that brings us to 2019, but these trajectories are also the same. What you'll notice here is that these atypical antipsychotic prescriptions are going to kids with ADHD and conduct disorder. They're being written off-label. I wouldn't say that that's contraindicated in all cases, but I wonder about these trends. Early onset conduct disorder, medications, juvenile justice, substance use disorder, medication, incarceration, and antisocial personality disorder, incarcerated. So I should have shown this before I showed the fast track slide, and I think I'll do that the next time around. That would end on a more positive note, that we can affect change in this progression. What about girls? So we were asked by Paul to talk about sex differences, and a lot of our work has moved into what about girls. And so that's what I want to use the rest of my time for. And I can't get my phone to stay on, but I think I have plenty of time. So Developmental pathways of impulsivity have not been that well characterized in girls. And if impulsivity is so highly heritable, something's going on with the girls too. Maybe there's a sex difference in impulsivity, but they're probably inheriting something, some level of impulsivity, and it turns out, yes, they are. So in 2009, our group published 2 review papers, and we reached a number of different conclusions, and I'll summarize those here. One is that similar family interaction patterns characterize delinquent boys and self-injury in girls. And when we talk about self-injury, we're talking mostly here about cutting behavior, which we all read about, which we probably dealt with clinically, and which is increasing in rates every year. Overlapping molecular genetic risk is observed for ADHD in boys and self-injury in girls, so we see some of the same dopaminergic and serotonergic vulnerabilities. Self-injury marks prospective risk for borderline personality disorder. Women who develop borderline personality disorder are often reared in the same families as an antisocial brother. And we've known this since 1993. I don't know, sometimes it's inexplicable why important papers in the literature don't get more attention, but this Goldman et al. Paper is one of those. There are strong sex biases in borderline personality disorder and antisocial personality disorder diagnoses. So, how do I put this? If I have lists of symptoms and I don't know the sex of the person with the symptoms, and I'm an experienced clinician, I diagnose some with borderline, some with antisocial. If I know the sex of the person with the symptoms, I diagnose all the women with borderline and all the men with antisocial. And this has been known for a long time. And so these things suggest some common etiology. And so our hypothesis from these papers is that impulsive girls with ADHD should be vulnerable to self-injury as opposed to delinquency, specifically in high-risk environments. There were no data available in 2009, but the data are now in, and I want to share those data with you. So here, ADHD, maltreatment, and self-harm for girls. My collaborator, Steve Henshaw, is at Berkeley, and these data are from the Berkeley Girls with ADHD longitudinal study. There have been some replications, one at Pittsburgh. It included 140 girls ages 6 to 12 with ADHD, and this might seem like a small sample, and by current standards, it is a smallish sample, but for all girls with severe ADHD, it's an accomplishment. They were followed up in their late teens and early adulthood. So our initial diagnosis in middle school, followed up in late teens, early adulthood. Girls with ADHD, and specifically the hyperactive and combined subtype, so let's not even think about inattentive, that's off the table, who also incur physical and or sexual abuse, exhibit alarming rates of self-injury and suicide attempts. So if we look at self-injury rates, the population prevalence, so again, we're talking mostly about cutting here, the population prevalence now is alarmingly high, so it's approaching 20% of girls dabbling in self-injury at some point in development. In maltreated samples, that goes up to 25+%, about 30% in ADHD-only samples, but among girls with ADHD who were maltreated, we're seeing rates of self-injury at 50%. This is even more troubling. These are suicide attempts. Population prevalence, despite all we hear, is still very low. Maltreatment confers elevated risk for suicide attempts. ADHD confers elevated risk for suicide attempts. The confluence of ADHD and maltreatment confers a 33% risk for suicide attempts by late adolescence and early adulthood for vulnerable girls. And I would argue, of course, any time we can identify this level of vulnerability prospectively at ages 6 to 12, it's incumbent on us to try to do something, to try to formulate prevention programs. These are data from the CDC that show women's suicide rates from 1999 to 2014. And what we see is increases in every single age group. So those range from 31% increase to 63% increase until we get to 10 to 14-year-olds. Even though 10 to 14-year-olds are still showing the lowest rates of suicide, those rates have jumped 300%. Well, they jumped 300% in 15 years from 1999 to 2014. And so these women who are at such high risk, or these girls who are at such high risk, are becoming women who are at high risk. So one of the things that we've done is examine ADHD girls' interactions with their moms and looked at patterns of autonomic nervous system function. Adrian was talking about heart rate. We're looking at a parsing of heart rate into its sympathetic and parasympathetic nervous system components. And this was a smallish study. All of the studies I'm going to talk about are smallish in size. We're working our way up. I have to do sometimes the foundational work with smaller studies. And so these girls were all recruited solely on the basis of self-harm. We didn't exclude anything. All we wanted to know is, have you engaged in cutting behavior, and is it serious enough for entry into the study? I can talk about entry criteria, severity criteria more if you'd like, but interestingly, all of them, I'm sorry, not all of them, but as a group, they scored above the clinical range on ADHD, T-scores greater than 70. We have them engage in a diet conflict task with their mothers, so we sit them in a room together, and this is a standard procedure. You have them come up with a bunch of things they argue about all the time, and you pick one that's not too intense, and you say, go. And they don't have any trouble whatsoever with this. I can't imagine having done it when I was a teen, but I wasn't a self-injuring adolescent girl either. So, we used a fancy technique called nonlinear dynamic modeling to look at how girls and moms were responding to each other at the physiological level. And what we see here is that girls in the self-injuring group, we had a depressed-only control group because most self-injurers are depressed. Girls in the self-injuring group were responding strongly to their mother's aversive behaviors. So yelling, criticism, those kinds of things. So a strong physiological response that differentiated them from the others over the course of a 10-minute discussion task. These are 10 seconds, or seconds. A sympathetic nervous system measure, we found the same thing. So these girls are exquisitely sensitive to criticism and anger on the part of their mothers. And notably, there weren't differences in levels of those behaviors because of the nature of the task. That extends previous work with ADHD boys to self-injuring girls. So we'd already known this was the case with boys with ADHD. Based on our work in my group and others' work done over the last 30 years. And so this is a new finding. It shows the same is true for girls with ADHD, who self-harm. We then looked at self-harming girls' neural responses to reward. So the same kind of paradigm in the scanner where we give them money for correct responses. We looked at patterns of striatal and amygdala reactivity and orbital frontal cortex reactivity to incentives. Smallish study again. And again, they were recruited based only on the basis of significant cutting behavior, not on ADHD symptoms, yet ADHD symptoms were elevated. As in studies with boys, we used Brian Knutson's monetary incentive delay task. Here's a depiction of the results, and we found striatal, orbital frontal, and amygdalar regions in which self-injuring girls exhibited less activation to reward cues. Now, we're not at a point in neuroscience where we can look at scans and diagnose. But if you look at these group-based differences, and if I were to have shown someone who, with expertise in ADHD research, these scans, they would have said, oh yeah, you compared an ADHD group of boys to a control group of boys. But we didn't do that. These are self-injuring girls. So like boys with ADHD, girls recruited for self-harm show blunted responding to incentives in both striatal and orbital frontal brain regions. We then looked at structure, brain structure, and self-harm among girls, and this is the same sample, it's just a structural analysis, and we found smaller bilateral insula and right inferior frontal gyrus volumes in self-injuries. The insula, James mentioned, it's important for self-regulation and emotional regulation. Here are the findings. It's always nice to show a picture. Those, I've already mentioned that. So findings, again, parallel those from externalizing males, adult women with borderline personality disorder, and in adolescents on first presentation of borderline personality disorder. So to summarize for self-injuring girls, like boys with ADHD, girls with ADHD appear to be vulnerable to developing more severe forms of psychopathology in high-risk environments. Their behavioral trajectories are moderated by sex. Girls go in one direction. And I don't even want to say it's one direction or another. There are different manifestations in boys versus girls. Boys are more vulnerable to delinquency. Girls are more vulnerable to self-injury. And these are not exclusive outcomes. We find self-injuring boys. We find delinquent girls. Self-injuring girls with ADHD experience similar family dynamics, similar neural responses, and we feel that we can now at least speculate about pathways from early impulsivity to later self-harm. And this is our expanded theoretical model. And like all good theoretical models, it's unfalsifiable. But here we've got trait impulsivity, we've got self and emotion dysregulation taking on increasing importance across development. Again, I want to emphasize how highly socialized self and emotion dysregulation are, how the brain regions that underlie self and emotion regulation are sensitive to environmental inputs across development, whereas trait impulsivity is highly, highly heritable. And so here we've got girls in red, boys in blue. I've fallen to the tradition. Progressing from ADHD to oppositional defiant disorder, and then somewhere in elementary school, girls start engaging in self-harm, and boys are engaging in conduct problems, and they're hanging out together, it turns out. We see worsening self-harm versus delinquency, substance use and suicidal behavior versus substance use and criminality, and then suicide attempts and borderline personality disorder, and criminal justice exposure and antisocial personality disorder for males. And again, one thing that's really important to note is that women who meet this description are hanging out with men who meet this description. And so they're raised in the same families growing up, and they end up in the same families in adulthood. Through, again, a number of different risk exposures. And we know what these risk exposures are. And thankfully we have, again, Carolyn, I'll give you one more shout out. People who know how to intervene right here before this progression emerges. And in fact, some of the intervention work that Carolyn's done, I was a happy collaborator on. And we showed that some of these autonomic neural signatures, if you will, of aggression can be altered with early intervention in the preschool years, which is really encouraging. So I think that is all I've got. I just want to acknowledge a bunch of people I've worked with over the years and take questions.
Thank you for a really wonderful discussion and talk. I want to focus a bit on the earlier end of your developmental trajectory, particularly where you start with ADHD. The work of Bruce Perry and many other people suggests that there's a tremendous overlap between PTSD in children at that age and ADHD, and that in fact many children with ADHD are actually experiencing symptomatology from trauma, particularly being exposed to violence in the home.
I know Bruce, I respect Bruce's work. My belief is that we need to do careful assessments, that certainly experience of trauma is going to magnify heritable ADHD. There's no question about that, and that is sort of interwoven into the model that I presented, even though I didn't talk specifically about maltreatment until I got to the girls. So I wouldn't argue with that. Nevertheless, we do know that impulsivity is a highly heritable trait. Another interesting and sad commentary is that girls with ADHD are more likely to be abused and maltreated, both physically and sexually. So, so that complicates matters even further, but thank you for asking that question.
Could you describe some of the research that's been done on this differentiation that we see in a lot of different ways? For example, Casper's article on the costs of the Dunedin group incurred in their 30s and 40s shows hospitalization for females and criminalization, imprisonment for males. The cost more or less corresponds to what you're describing here.
Right.
But I'm just wondering, what is there some evolutionary basis for this internalization and externalization difference?
Well, there could be, and of course we've been talking about those possibilities earlier. Instrumental aggression isn't very useful to women, and how do we disentangle that, right? So it's, I don't know if James would speak to that, but I mean, women are smaller, they're weaker, and they're placing themselves in danger when they engage in instrumental aggression, and that could be a driving factor that has nothing to do with genetics, nothing to do with hormones, nothing to do with evolution. Well, I guess indirectly with evolution, but yeah, so I don't know the answer. I'm just throwing out everything I can think of, which is what you do when you don't know the answer.
Genetics. Started off talking about how a child's biology very early in life might be very different. They grow up poor, or they grow up with a traumatic environment. And I think the developmental cascade that you presented is very powerful, and I appreciate you sharing that with us and walking us through it. I guess the question I have is what are the implications for cognitive disorder and antisocial personality disorder, which to me, and as well as callous unemotional traits, seem like thin constructs compared to this developmental cascade, and I just wondered how you would, whether you see it as challenging actually those models.
I don't see it as a challenge to those models. I would argue that, and I have in some of our publications, that this developmental trajectory probably captures a majority of individuals who develop antisocial personality disorder. What I don't speak to is callous unemotional traits. I think, I thought James' comments on that were fabulous, that I was reminded of the old joke, there are 10 kinds of people in the world, those who understand binary and those who don't. Callous unemotional traits and impulsivity, I believe, are separate constructs. And that the kids I'm afraid to be in the room with are the impulsive ones who are callous and unemotional as well. And so I don't speak to that. There are certainly kids embedded in here who have callous unemotional traits, but that's, yeah, does that help?
It does, but I think where I would disagree, or where I think there's really an interesting point, is that callous unemotional kids, they haven't done that much work, at least maybe you know, but I don't know about that kids that have been traumatized, their heart rates go down, they're designated as callous unemotional, and many studies are done where they don't study those kids.
Right.
They don't study the trauma histories, they ignore them, and then they act like this biological cascade, and these are bad kids.
Well, I think a lot of us, well, I would never say that these are bad kids. What I will say is that things have changed in the 20 years I've been in the business, if you will. There were unfortunate external factors that kept us from assessing trauma and maltreatment. That was a big part of my presentation for girls, and we assess that now. We didn't when I first started doing my work. You couldn't get your stuff through an institutional review board if you were going to ask parents about maltreatment. Everything has changed, and that's a fabulous development because we need to know about those things.
I wonder if you could go back to the slide on the female suicides, because I've got a couple questions or observations around that, if it's quick to find it. I think what was really striking... Yeah.
Sorry.
No, it's the one, sorry, with the two different time frames. The actual suicides.
Oh, this one? Next one. Okay, we'll just leave it like that.
Yes,
so I don't have to go through the emotions. Yeah.
That's the one. Well, if you can enlarge that, I think it will help. So it's just because the different times, right? It's 1999 and 2014, 15 years apart. So one point, it's not really a point of clarification, but it's to bring something up. You were talking about girls growing into women who are at greater risk, but if these are successful suicides, of course, they're not entering the next age categories. But in essence, to me, that brings up this issue of what is really going on here in terms of the chronos system. What has changed in 15 years that has heightened these risks? And do we find similar risks for externalizing behaviors, for aggression, for violence amongst boys that potentially mirror some of these changes over time? And I think that really does speak to the core of some of these nature-nurture arguments about what's happening in the etiology of violence and aggression, whether it's externalized or self-directed.
Right. In terms of nature-nurture, I always answer the question is yes. Is nature or nurture driving our effects? We don't see the increases in violence and delinquency and aggression that we've seen for suicide. However, it's important to note that boys in this age range actually suicide at higher rates than girls. They tend to use more effective methods. We haven't seen the increase to the same degree among boys as we've seen in girls. But suicide is going up, and this is something for all of us to try to figure out, to try to wrap our heads around and do something about what's driving these effects. I have my own thoughts, but it seems like it's for a different conference. I don't know, and we might not have time. Certainly, girls' involvement in social media is not helping, but I couldn't even for a second say that's driving the entire effect.
I want to make a comment and then see if you have a thought about it. One of the things that we found in looking at in our study with kids with conduct problems between the ages of 3 and 8 was that we got, yes, 5 boys for every girl. But when we looked at the girls and their interactions, they weren't nearly as overtly aggressive as the boys. But the girls were superior in their ability to be non-compliant and devious and sort of more manipulative. They were actually way better than the boys. The concern I had was numbered. It was really, why aren't more girls referred to us? And that might be because they're not out there plummeting some other child on the playground. But do we wait too long to intervene with girls? Then we get to the point where they're pretty like self-injury. We start giving them attention then. So again, I'm coming back to this whole idea of starting earlier and efforts. I know this is conference about boys, but are we leaving out girls that really need some attention?
I couldn't agree more. The observation about girls being instrumental in a different way is very interesting. It suggests that, hey, they can be just as instrumental, but not through aggression. And my hypothesis is that because it doesn't work. But very interesting. Thank you.